The gun was already pressed against her temple when Sheriff Tobias Irwin kicked open the door of the Dustfall jailhouse and found her standing in the middle of the cell block with her hands raised and a dead man at her feet. "Don't move," he said, his Colt aimed steady at the center of her chest. "Not 1 inch." She didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She just turned her dark eyes toward him with a look that wasn't fear at all. It was something worse. It was exhaustion, the kind that lives so deep in a person that even a loaded gun can't shake it loose anymore. "He's dead," she said. "I didn't kill him." Tobias looked at the body. The man was face down, one boot off, a knife still in his belt that had never been drawn. There was no blood on her hands, no wound on the body that he could see from where he stood. But she was standing over a corpse in a locked cell in the middle of the night, and she had broken into his jail, and every instinct he'd spent 12 years building as a lawman told him something enormous was wrong here. "Step back from him," Tobias said. She stepped back. "Tell me who you are." She said nothing for a long moment, and the silence in the jailhouse was so complete he could hear the wind pressing itself against the adobe walls like it was trying to get in and listen. "My name is Sadie Keller," she finally said. "And if you let me ride out of Dustfall tonight, I will never be your problem again." He should have let her. That was the thing he'd think about later, lying awake in the dark with the smell of desert sage coming through the window and the whole weight of what happened settling over him like a second skin. He should have opened that cell door and pointed east and watched her disappear into the black New Mexico night and let the whole strange business be someone else's trouble. But he didn't. Because there was something in the way she said it. The tight, controlled certainty of a woman who had been running so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stop, and he found he couldn't make himself open that door. "Not yet." "You're not going anywhere," Tobias said. "Not until I understand what happened here." She closed her eyes, and for just 1 second before she locked everything back behind that wall she'd clearly been building for years, he saw something crack across her face. Not relief, not exactly, but something close to it. Like a woman who had been desperate for someone to stop her and had given up hope that anyone would. That was where it started. In a jail cell at 2 in the morning in the autumn of 1882, with a dead man on the floor and a stranger who carried secrets like other people carry scars, invisibly, but heavy enough to change the way they moved through the world. 3 weeks earlier, Dustfall, New Mexico territory, had been exactly the kind of town that knew its own rhythms and trusted them. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines of red sandstone, close enough to the Rio Grande that on still evenings you could smell the water if you stood at the south end of Main Street and breathed slow. The town had been established in 1871, built up around a trading post that grew into a mercantile, which drew a church, which drew families, which drew everything else. By 1882, it had a population of 314 souls, a telegraph office, a school that operated 8 months a year, a doctor who was better than most frontier towns deserved, and a sheriff who had been elected 4 consecutive times because he was honest and consistent, and because people in small towns value predictability nearly as much as they value justice. Tobias Irwin was 34 years old. He had sandy brown hair that had started going gray at the temples since his deputy, a young man named Pete Carver, had been shot the previous spring during a cattle dispute. Pete had recovered, mostly. Tobias's hair had not gone back. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder, with hands that were better suited to carpentry than fighting but had learned to do both when necessary. He had been born in Tennessee, moved to Texas at 15 with his family, and made his way to New Mexico at 22 after the kind of personal upheaval that a man doesn't always want to explain in detail. He had never been married. He had come close once, with a woman named Clara, but Clara had wanted Chicago and he had wanted the sky that existed above the desert at night, which is a sky unlike any other sky on earth. And they had parted without bitterness, but with a sadness that took several years to fully metabolize. He was not a lonely man, but he was alone in the way that very self-sufficient people sometimes are, surrounded by community, trusted by everyone, intimate with no one. He was eating breakfast at the counter of Marjorie Walsh's dining room when Sadie Keller rode into Dustfall. He heard the horse before he saw it, a sorrel mare moving at a careful trot down the center of Main Street, which was unusual because most riders either came in fast or came in slow and deliberate, and this was neither. It was the pace of someone managing pain. He set down his coffee cup and turned on his stool and looked through the window. She was dressed in trail clothes. A canvas duster that had been brown once and was now the color of everything. A dark hat pulled low, riding boots that had seen serious use. She sat the horse with the kind of posture that doesn't come from comfort but from discipline. She was holding herself upright through concentration, not ease. As she passed the window of the dining room, the morning light hit the side of her face, and Tobias noticed a bruise along her jaw that was turning yellow-green, which meant it was several days old. There was a canvas saddlebag behind the saddle, bulging on one side and a rifle scabbard on the right. No shotgun. The rifle looked like a Winchester 1873, standard and practical. She tied the mare outside the general store, spoke to her briefly with her hand on the horse's neck, and went inside. Tobias went back to his breakfast, but he watched the street. She came out of the general store 20 minutes later carrying oats for the horse and something wrapped in brown paper, which turned out to be a wedge of hard cheese and a handful of dried apricots, which he didn't know at the time. He watched her feed the mare and eat her own breakfast standing up in the street, unhurried, scanning the buildings in the methodical way of someone doing a threat assessment, without wanting it to look like a threat assessment. He found himself standing in the street before he'd made a conscious decision to do it. "Morning," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they were the kind of eyes that had been made careful by experience. She took in the badge on his vest in under a second and filed it the way you file something you've been expecting. "Morning," she said. "Just passing through." "That was the plan," she said. There was something in the phrasing, "that was the plan," that suggested the plan might be under some renegotiation. "Your horse looks like she could use a day's rest," Tobias said. It was true. The mare was tired in the way that spoke of hard miles. "She'll be fine." "Where you headed?" She chewed a piece of dried apricot and considered him. "Is this official business, Sheriff, or are you just curious?" "Both," he said honestly. She almost smiled at that. "Almost. I'm heading to Chilarosa." Chilarosa was southeast of Dustfall by about 40 miles. It was a bigger town, more transient, the kind of place where a person could lose themselves without too much effort. Tobias had no particular reason to distrust that information, except that people who were actually going to Chilarosa generally came from the northwest, and she had ridden in from the north, which was a slightly indirect route. "Chilarosa's a good 2-day ride from here if you push," he said. "You've got a farrier on the east end of town, Murphy's. He's decent and reasonable. Might be worth having that mare's shoes checked before you go." She looked at the horse and then back at him. "Thank you," she said, and it was genuine, not polite. There was a difference. She did take the mare to Murphy's, and she did not leave that afternoon as Tobias had assumed she would. He watched her from the periphery of his day. He had a property dispute to mediate between two ranchers on the north edge of town. Then a report of a suspicious camp out past the river bend that turned out to be a harmless family of travelers. Then the regular business of walking the town in the evening and making himself visible. But he noted where she was. She'd taken a room at the Dustfall Hotel, a two-story building that was more clean than grand, run by a widow named Edna Price, who knew everything that happened under her roof and a fair amount of what happened around it. He did not go back and speak to Sadie Keller that first day, but he thought about her more than the occasion seemed to warrant, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. She was still in Dustfall the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third day, he encountered her at the well in the center of town, where she was filling a canvas-sided bucket while her horse stood patiently behind her. The morning was cool and sharp, the kind of October morning in New Mexico that smells like wood smoke and dry earth and something metallic from the mountains. "Your horse is still resting," he said. "Murphy said 2 more days," she replied without looking up from the well crank. Her left rear shoe was pulling away from the hoof wall. "He said if I pushed her hard on rocky ground I'd lame her." "Murphy's right." "Murphy's right," she agreed. He leaned against the well housing and looked at the street and thought about what to say next. It had been a while since he'd had to think about what to say next to someone. "You eaten this morning?" he asked. She looked at him then with that careful, assessing gaze. "Why?" "Because Marjorie Walsh makes the best biscuits in the New Mexico territory, and she makes them on Tuesdays, and today is Tuesday." A long pause. The well chain rattled softly. "I don't want charity," she said. "It's a meal at a counter," he said. "Costs 20 cents. "That's not charity, that's commerce." She studied him for another moment, and he had the distinct sense that she was making some kind of calculation he wasn't fully privy to. Then she set the bucket down and said, "All right." Marjorie Walsh's dining room occupied the front half of a long building that had been everything from a saloon to a barber shop in its various lives. Now it had 6 tables covered in blue checked oilcloth, a counter with 8 stools, and a wood stove that was the social and thermal center of the establishment. Marjorie herself was 61, built like she'd been assembled from raw determination, and she had an uncanny ability to make people feel simultaneously welcome and slightly judged, which was a social talent Tobias had always admired. He and Sadie sat at the counter. Marjorie brought coffee without being asked and biscuits without being asked, and then stood back with her arms folded and watched them with the neutral expression of a woman gathering data. "Where you from?" Tobias asked. "Kansas originally," Sadie said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug the way people do when they've been cold for a long time, even if the temperature is fine. "Then Colorado for a while. I've been moving around. Family," she looked at her coffee. "Not anymore." He let that sit where she put it. He'd learned, over years of talking to people in trouble and people not in trouble and people who didn't know yet which category they were in, that certain answers close a door, and the respectful thing is not to stand in the doorway trying to force it back open. "What about you?" she asked, which surprised him slightly. Most people who were guarded didn't invite reciprocity. "Born in Tennessee," he said. "Grew up in Texas, came out here about 12 years ago." "Why New Mexico, the sky?" he said. "I know that sounds strange. It doesn't," she said quietly. She looked out the window at the strip of blue above the roofline across the street. "The sky out here is different from everywhere else, like it's bigger than sky has a right to be." "Exactly," he said. It was a small moment, a shared observation about the quality of light over Red Rock Desert. But it was the first time they'd said something to each other that wasn't transactional or cautious, and Tobias was aware of it in his chest the way you're aware of a door opening somewhere in a house that's been closed up for a while. Not alarming, just a change in the air pressure. "Do you like this work?" she asked. "Being a sheriff?" "I like doing it right," he said. Some days more than others. Do I like being a sheriff? Do you like what you do? He said, and then realized that was a more loaded question than he'd intended. Sorry, I don't know what you do. That's all right, she said. I used to be a school teacher. Used to be, for 6 years, she said. In Dodge City, before things got complicated, he waited. She didn't elaborate. They finished their biscuits and their coffee, and he paid the 20 cents each, and she did not protest as strongly as she had at the well, which he took as a small sign of something. She was still in Dustfall the next day, and the day after that. Murphy needed the full 4 days with the mare. Tobias found reasons to encounter her, not manufactured reasons exactly, but he noticed that when his route through town put him in the vicinity of the hotel or the well or the mercantile at a time she was likely to be there, he did not redirect himself. He learned things about her in the way you learn things about someone when you're paying attention without being direct. She was meticulous about her horse. She read. He'd seen her twice with a book from Edna Price's small lending shelf. She was unfailingly polite to everyone she interacted with, but she kept people at arm's length with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for years. She didn't drink. She sat with her back to walls. And occasionally, when she didn't know he could see her, she would stop whatever she was doing and scan the street with an expression that had nothing casual in it at all. She was watching for someone. He'd known it from the first morning, in the way you know something without knowing you know it. But on the 4th night, sitting at his desk after dark with the paperwork of an ordinary week spread before him, it crystallized into something he could name. Sadie Keller was in Dustfall because it was temporarily safe, or she thought it was. She was resting her horse and herself. She was preparing for the next leg of something that had nothing to do with Chilarosa. And whatever she was running from, it was not a small thing. He didn't go to talk to her about it that night. He told himself it wasn't his business, which was partially true. But the larger truth was that he was not ready yet for the conversation to become official. Because once it became official, the distance between them would be formalized, and he was not sure he wanted that. The following morning, the 5th day, Murphy released the mare and Sadie loaded her saddlebags and led her out of the livery into the pale October morning light. Tobias was standing in the street, not by design or so he told himself, but because he had been walking east on Main Street at that exact moment, and there she was. She saw him. She paused with the mare's reins in her hand. "I'm heading out," she said. "I see that." A moment passed between them that was fuller than the words on either side of it. "Thank you," she said, "for the biscuits." "Thank Murphy," he said. "He kept your horse here long enough for you to eat them." That almost smile again. He'd been cataloging those. There weren't many of them, but they were significant in the way that rare things are significant. She put her foot in the stirrup and he said, "Sadie." She stopped. He didn't have a plan. He hadn't been going to say anything. But the word came out with the shape of more words behind it, and she was waiting for them, and so he said the only honest thing he had. "Whatever you're running from," he said, "you look tired." Her hand tightened on the saddle horn. She was looking at the road ahead of her, not at him. "Everyone looks tired out here," she said. "It's the desert." "It's not the desert," he said, another long silence. The mare shifted her weight. "I've been tired for 2 years," she said finally, and the simplicity of it hit him like something physical. Not 2 weeks, not 2 months, 2 years. He didn't know what that meant in specifics, but he knew it meant something that had been happening to this woman steadily and without respite for longer than most people could sustain whatever it was. "I've got a spare chair on my porch," he said, "in case you ever want to not be moving for a while." She looked at him then, full on, and he saw the same thing he'd see weeks later in the jail cell, that deep-down exhaustion, and underneath it, something she was trying very hard not to let be hope. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. She rode east. He watched her go until she was past the last buildings and the road curved around the base of the sandstone ridge and she disappeared. He told himself she was gone. She came back on the 6th day. Just before noon from the east, at that same careful, controlled pace. She tied the mare at the water trough outside his office and walked in like someone who had made a decision that was costing her something. He was behind his desk. He did not say anything because he recognized the quality of the moment. "Someone is coming here," she said. "To Dustfall. Looking for me. I think within the week. I want to be gone before he arrives, but I need you to know because if he does arrive and asks about me, I need to know if you're going to tell him where I went." Tobias leaned back in his chair. "Who is he?" "His name is Roy Carlin," she said. "He operates out of Colorado. He owns a freight operation as a front, but he's been running stolen government contracts up and down the territory for 3 years. He has connections to 2 county sheriffs and a federal land agent, which is why no one has been able to touch him." "And what's your connection to him?" She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the suspect's chair, which he registered with some awareness, and folded her hands on her knee. "I worked for his shipping operation for 8 months after I left teaching. I didn't know what it was. When I found out, I documented what I knew and sent copies to the marshal's office in Santa Fe. You were a witness." "I was a witness," she said. "And someone in Santa Fe told him about it, which means someone in that office is connected to Carlin's operation, which means I have no protection from that end. And the copies I sent are sitting in someone's drawer collecting dust, and Roy Carlin has been paying men to find me for 2 years." It all clicked into place with the precision of a well-made lock. The bruise, the scanning of streets, the careful pace, the choice of Chilarosa, a destination she'd probably already changed twice. The 2 years of tiredness. "Why come back and tell me this?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Because you're the first lawman in 2 years who looked at me like a person instead of a problem," she said. "And because I needed to tell someone the truth. I have been carrying this for a long time and I am very tired of carrying it alone." Tobias sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." She did. It took 2 hours, sitting across from each other in his office with the afternoon light shifting across the floor between them, and he listened the way he listened when something mattered, which was completely. She told him about the job in Colorado, about the freight routes that didn't match the manifests, about the conversations she'd overheard, and the documents she'd found in the office filing cabinet late on a Thursday when she'd stayed after hours to finish a ledger entry. She told him about the ride to the nearest town with a telegraph, the message she'd sent to the marshal's service, and the 2 days later when Roy Carlin called her into his office with 2 other men in the room, and looked at her across his enormous mahogany desk with a smile that had no warmth anywhere in it. She'd run that night. She'd taken her horse and a saddlebag and $40 she had saved, and she had ridden south into the dark. "He's methodical," she said. "He doesn't rush. He's been tracking me through informants in every town I've stopped in. I think someone in Dustfall may have already told him I was here. A rider went east the day after I arrived. I don't know for certain, but I need to assume." "Describe Carlin," Tobias said. She described him. Tall, heavyset, mid-40s, blonde hair going white, a scar through his left eyebrow from some old violence. He had a man who traveled with him named Dodd, who was the violence Carlin himself preferred not to perform personally. Tobias wrote both descriptions in his notebook. "You're not leaving," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. You're not leaving Dustfall," he said. "Not right now, because if what you're saying is accurate and I believe you, then riding out into open country alone is exactly the wrong strategy. You've been doing that for 2 years, and they keep finding you because a lone rider is easy to track and harder to protect. And what's the better strategy? She asked, with an edge of challenge in it that he thought she probably didn't know was there. Staying somewhere where there are witnesses, he said, and a sheriff, and people who can corroborate your presence and your behavior and your account of events, which would be useful if this ends up in front of a judge. She stared at him for a long moment. What you're describing, she said carefully, is you keeping me here. I'm describing you making a strategic choice to remain in a protected location, he said. The door is not locked. You're not under arrest. But I am asking you, as the law in this jurisdiction, to consider staying until I can get a telegraph to someone in the marshal's service I trust, which is not in Santa Fe. Who do you trust? A man named Harold Fitch in Albuquerque, he said. He was a U.S. Marshal for 11 years. He retired, but he still has connections, and more importantly, he has integrity that is not for sale at any price I've ever heard offered. Sadie looked at her hands. The afternoon light was long and golden now, coming through the west window of the office and laying itself across the floorboards in rectangles. I will stay for 3 days, she said. If you can't get word to Fitch and have something concrete by then, I need to keep moving. 3 days, he agreed. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. I've never told anyone the whole thing, she said. Not from the beginning like that. How did it feel? He asked. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Like setting down something very heavy, she said. I hadn't realized how heavy it was until just now. He sent the telegraph to Harold Fitch in Albuquerque that evening. The reply came back the following morning, terse and definitive in the way of men who had spent careers saying important things in few words. Roy Carlin was a genuine subject of federal inquiry. The Santa Fe office had been compromised by a single individual now under investigation, and Fitch could send a federal deputy to Dustfall within 6 days if Tobias could keep Sadie Keller safe and in place until then. 6 days. He went to the hotel and told her. She stood in the narrow doorway of her room with her arms crossed, and he could see her working through it, calculating, weighing the risk of staying against the risk of moving. 6 days, she said. 6 days, he said. And you think you can keep Carlin away for 6 days if he shows up? I think I can make things very difficult for him if he shows up in my jurisdiction without cause, Tobias said. He has no warrant. You've committed no crime. He can't compel me to hand you over. He'll have men with him, she said. Dodd and at least 2 others based on what I've seen before. This is my town, he said. I know every building, every street, every person in it. I know who I can call on. He doesn't have any of that. She looked at him steadily. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't know me. You have no reason to. You came back, he said. When you could have ridden on and never said a word, you came back and told me the truth. That matters. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What do you need from me? Stay visible, he said. Don't try to disappear. And if you see anything that doesn't feel right, come to me immediately, not after you've processed it. Immediately, she nodded. All right. Those 6 days were the beginning of something that Tobias would not be able to fully articulate later, but which he would remember in almost perfect sensory detail. The way October light fell on Dustfall, the smell of the wood stove in Marjorie's dining room, the specific quality of conversations held with someone whose guard was slowly, deliberately coming down. They walked together on the 2nd day, at his suggestion, on the premise that she should know the town's layout for her own safety. He showed her the routes between buildings, the water sources, the places that had good sight lines to the road in both directions. It was practical. It was also the longest he'd spent in continuous company with another person in recent memory, and he found that the time didn't weigh on him the way it sometimes did, which was a thing he noticed and filed. She asked about his history on the third day. They were sitting on the porch of his office in the thin afternoon sun, and the question came naturally out of a conversation about the territory and how it had changed. "What brought you to law work?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer, which was more complicated than the convenient one, and decided she'd earned the honest one. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger. 16 when I was 20. There was a situation. A man in our Texas town who was using his position to take advantage of people who couldn't fight back. My brother tried to report it to the local law and was told to mind himself. He was young and angry, and he handled it in a way he shouldn't have, and he went to prison for it." "What happened to your brother?" she asked quietly. "He died in that prison," Tobias said. 3 years in, fever." A long pause. The wind moved through the street and turned the dust in small, lazy spirals. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the full sense, not as a social formality. "I became a lawman because I believe in what it's supposed to be," he said. "Not what it sometimes is, what it's supposed to be. Someone with the authority to stand between people who have power and people who don't, and hold that line." She looked at him for a moment. "That's rare," she said, "finding people who do it because it's supposed to mean something." "You became a teacher for similar reasons, I suspect," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that's true." A pause. "I loved it. The children and I, there was this thing that would happen sometimes when something clicked for one of them, some concept they'd been fighting with. And you'd see the understanding arrive in their face, and it felt like witnessing something important." She stopped. "I miss it." "You could go back to it," he said. "Maybe," she said. "After this is over, if it ever is." "It will be," he said. She looked at him with a kind of careful hope that she was clearly not fully permitting herself. "You seem very certain." "I'm not always certain," he said, "but I am about this." She didn't say anything for a while. They sat in the cooling afternoon air and watched the town move through its ordinary rhythms, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that builds between two people who are learning each other. Roy Carlin arrived on the 5th day. Tobias was at the south end of Main Street when he saw the 4 riders come around the base of the ridge from the north, which meant they'd come from the direction of Santa Fe, not Colorado, which told him they had information about where she was before they arrived. He watched them come and identified the figures against Sadie's descriptions. Carlin in the lead, blonde going to white, built like a building. Beside him, a wiry, dark-haired man who would be Dodd. 2 others behind them who were the generic hardware of hired threats. He walked to the center of the street and waited. Carlin pulled up in front of him. The 4 horses blew and shifted. Main Street's ordinary foot traffic had thinned in that instinctive way of town populations who recognize tension without being told about it. "Morning," Tobias said. "Sheriff Tobias Irwin. Welcome to Dustfall. Can I help you?" Carlin looked down at him from his horse. He had eyes the pale blue of very cold water, and the smile Sadie had described present, warm on the surface and beneath it nothing. "Looking for a woman," Carlin said. "Name of Sadie Keller. We believe she may have passed through here." "I know Sadie Keller," Tobias said. "What's your interest in her?" "She has property belonging to my company," Carlin said smoothly. "Documents she removed without authorization. We're simply here to recover them." "Do you have a warrant for that recovery?" Tobias asked, a slight hesitation. "This is a civil matter, Sheriff." "Then you'll want to pursue it through civil channels," Tobias said. "File a complaint with the court in Santa Fe. In the meantime, I have no cause to assist you in locating anyone in my jurisdiction, and I'd ask that you and your men keep the peace while you're here." Dodd, the wiry man beside Carlin, had been staring at Tobias with a flat, assessing look through this entire exchange. Tobias was aware of it the way you're aware of a thing that is preparing to become a problem. "We're not looking for trouble, Sheriff," Carlin said. "I'm relieved to hear it," Tobias said. "You're welcome to water your horses and take a meal before you head back to wherever you're headed." There was a moment of loaded silence. Then Carlin turned his horse and walked it toward the water trough, and the others followed, and Tobias let out a breath he had been keeping very still. He went directly to the hotel. Sadie was at the window when he knocked, which meant she'd seen them arrive. He could see it in her face. The color had left it, and what remained was a controlled, deliberate stillness that he recognized as courage being deployed in real time. "He's here," she said. "He's here," he confirmed. "I've told him he has no standing in this jurisdiction without a warrant. He can't compel anything." "You don't know Carlin," she said. "He doesn't need standing. He'll wait. He'll find another way. He always does." "The federal deputy arrives tomorrow," Tobias said. "I got word this morning. One more day." She pressed her hand against the window glass and looked at the street below, where Carlin and his men were visible at the water trough. "What if he acts tonight?" she said. "He won't make a public move," Tobias said. "Not with the whole town watching. He's been careful this long because careful is what's kept him out of prison." "Dodd makes moves," she said. "Carlin doesn't, but Dodd does." Tobias thought about the flat eyes of the wiry man. "I'll have my deputy keep watch on this building tonight. Pete Carver. He's reliable." She turned from the window and looked at him. She was close enough that he could see the faint scar at the corner of her mouth that he'd noticed before, and filed away, as another question the answer to which probably lived in the same dark period as the bruise on her jaw. "Tobias," she said. It was the first time she'd used his name, just his name without the formality of his title. "I need you to know that if this doesn't end tomorrow the way you're planning, I will not put you or this town in further danger. I will go." "You will not go," he said quietly. "You can't, I know," he said. "I'm not holding you, I'm asking you. There's a difference." She stared at him. Something moved in her expression that was not the careful, controlled face she'd been showing him for days. Something underneath. Something that had to do with being asked rather than told, with the distinction between a choice and a compulsion. "One day," she said finally. "One day," he said. He stood guard himself that night, walking the perimeter of the hotel in rotation with Pete Carver. Carlin and his men had taken rooms at the far end of town, in the smaller and less reputable of Dustfall's 2 boarding establishments. They had eaten dinner quietly and retired, and the town had settled into its normal nighttime rhythms around them. Tobias was on his second rotation around the building, in the small hours between midnight and 3, when he passed the alley between the hotel and the Mercantile and heard something he shouldn't have heard. A door. Not the front door of the hotel, which he'd been watching. A side door. The service door that Edna Price used for laundry deliveries, which he hadn't thought about. He went around the back and found the door standing open. He went up the back stairs, hand on his gun, and along the second-floor corridor, and opened the door to the cell block. No, he was in the hotel now, not the jail. He reminded himself with that part of his brain that stays clinical when everything else is alerting. He opened the door to the corridor and found Sadie's room door standing open. He went to the jailhouse next, because he had a sudden cold certainty about where she had gone. This is where he found her. Standing over a body in the cell block, hands raised, with that look on her face like the floor of something very old had given way. He held his gun steady on her and said, "Tell me who you are." "My name is Sadie Keller," she said. "And if you let me ride out of Dustfall tonight, I will never be your problem again." He didn't open the door. He didn't open it because in that moment, looking at her standing over a body with her hands up and that ancient exhaustion in her eyes, he felt something that bypassed all of his lawman's training and landed somewhere much more fundamental. He did not want her to go. He kept his gun steady and said, "You're not going anywhere, not until I understand what happened here." He holstered his weapon after another moment, because she was clearly unarmed and clearly not the threat, and he went to the body on the floor and crouched beside it. The man was one of Carlin's two unnamed riders. He recognized the coat. Dodd was not here. The man was dead from what would turn out, on examination by the doctor the next morning, to be a heart seizure. He was perhaps 50, overweight, had the kind of color to him even in death that spoke of a heart that had been under strain. He had come here, apparently, and simply died. "Explain," Tobias said, standing up. "He was following me," Sadie said. Her hands were still up. "I saw him leave the boarding house and I thought he was coming to the hotel. I came out the side door to draw him away from Edna's guests. He followed me here. I was going to come to you. I didn't have time. He came in behind me through the window you keep unlocked at the back, and he was reaching for his gun, and then he grabbed his chest and fell." Tobias looked at the unlocked window. He'd been meaning to fix the latch for 6 months. "He was having a heart seizure," Tobias said. "I think so," she said. "I didn't touch him, I swear to you." He looked at her. She was telling the truth. He had been doing this long enough to know the difference, and she was telling the truth. "Put your hands down," he said. She lowered them. "Are you all right?" he asked. She laughed, a small, involuntary sound that was relief and exhaustion and the aftermath of terror all compressed into one, and then pressed her hand over her mouth. "I have been better," she said. "Come sit down," he said. He took her to his office and poured water from the pitcher on his desk and gave it to her, and she drank it without ceremony and set the cup down and looked at him across the desk in the lamplight. "The deputy from Fitch arrives tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't running. I want you to know that. I was trying to handle a situation without," she paused, "without having it become something that required you to put yourself in the middle of it." "That is my job," he said. "I know," she said. "But you've already done more than—" She stopped again, swallowed. Started over. "People don't generally go out of their way for me. Not since this started. People generally look at a woman with trouble following her and decide the trouble is hers alone to carry." He looked at her in the lamplight. She was genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional arrangement of features, and everything to do with the quality of the person inside. The intelligence in her eyes, the precision of her thinking, the courage she carried without performing it. "You should have had people going out of their way for you for the last 2 years, he said. "The fact that you didn't is not something you earned." She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was doing something complicated. All those layers of distance and protection shifting against a feeling that was apparently trying to come up through them. "Tobias," she said. "Sadie," he said. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said softly. "I mean in general, after this, if this resolves, I don't know what I do next or where I go or who I am on the other side of it. I've been so focused on surviving the immediate situation that I genuinely haven't thought past it." "You could think past it here," he said. She looked at him with that careful, not quite permitting herself hope expression. "In Dustfall, it's a good town," he said. "The sky is something." Something finally gave way in her face, not dramatically. It was a small, precise thing. The release of the particular kind of tension that comes from holding a wall up through an act of continuous will. She was still, and she was looking at him, and the look was unguarded in a way that nothing about her had been unguarded before. "The sky is something," she agreed softly. Pete Carver took care of the body and the paperwork, and Tobias walked Sadie back to the hotel in the blue-gray hour before dawn, and she went up the stairs without saying anything more but turned once at the landing and looked down at him in the lamplight of the hall, and the look lasted a full 3 seconds before she went on to her room. He stood in the lobby of Edna Price's hotel at 4:30 in the morning with his hat in his hand, and admitted to himself that he was completely and thoroughly in trouble of the best possible kind. The federal deputy arrived the following afternoon. His name was James Aldrin, a solid, quiet man in his late 30s with a federal badge and a satchel full of documents that Harold Fitch had assembled over the preceding weeks. He took Sadie's testimony in 2 hours, every detail she had, and he produced, to her visible shock, copies of the documents she had sent to Santa Fe 2 years earlier. They had not, it turned out, been destroyed. They had been sitting in the file of the compromised official, who had been under investigation himself for 4 months. Roy Carlin and Dodd were arrested at the boarding house without significant incident, and the 2 other riders were taken into federal custody as material witnesses. The arrest was clean and quick and official, and Tobias watched from across the street as Carlin was walked out of the building with his hands bound behind him, and the man's pale, cold eyes found Sadie where she stood on the boardwalk and held her gaze for one long moment. She did not look away. She stood on the boardwalk in the October afternoon sun, and she did not flinch, and Tobias watched Carlin look at her and see it, the understanding that this was over, that she had won, not through escape but through standing still. When the federal party had loaded their prisoners and ridden east toward Santa Fe, Sadie stood in the street for a long time. Tobias came to stand beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She took a long, slow breath. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and the faint mineral bite of the nearby river. "Like something is over," she said. "Like I'm not entirely sure what to do with that." "That's normal," he said. "Is it?" "I think so," he said. "When you've been in a state of emergency long enough, peace feels strange, like a language you knew once and have to practice again." She looked at him sideways. "That's unexpectedly poetic for a sheriff." "I have depths," he said. She laughed. Not the small, involuntary release of the night before, but a real laugh, full and unguarded and surprised out of her. And it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere below the sternum with real force. In the days that followed, Dustfall settled back into its rhythms, and Sadie Keller did not leave. She stayed at Edna Price's hotel, while she corresponded with Harold Fitch's office in Albuquerque about the formal requirements of her witness status and the timeline of the federal prosecution of Carlin and his associates. There were letters to write, statements to formalize, a process to navigate that would take months before it was resolved. She had, in effect, legitimate reasons to remain in one place for a while, but the legitimate reasons were not, Tobias suspected, the only reasons. He went to her with the spare chair on his porch on a Saturday morning 11 days after Carlin's arrest. He had not previously explained what he'd meant by that offer. He brought the chair from inside and set it on the porch beside his own and went in search of her. He found her at the well, which seemed to be their place, their specific intersection point, and he said, "Coffee and open air this morning." She looked at the chair under his arm with something that was fond, genuinely fond, and said, "Yes." They sat on his porch in the thin November light and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours. It was the first time they'd talked without emergency or investigation or strategy as the framing, and what happened without that framing was considerable. She told him about growing up in Kansas, about her mother who had been a fiercely educated woman who believed that her daughter should be equally educated in a time when that was not the universal expectation. She told him about discovering a love of mathematics that she'd hidden initially because it wasn't considered appropriate, and then had eventually stopped hiding because she was stubborn, which made him laugh. She told him about the 6 years of teaching in Dodge City, and the children she'd taught, and the specific ones she still thought about. He told her about the years before Dustfall, the wandering that looked like directionlessness from the outside, and had a purpose he couldn't quite name from the inside. He told her about the moment he'd arrived in Dustfall and stood in the street at first light, and looked at the mountains to the east turning pink in the dawn, and felt the specific sensation of arriving at a place you belong, which is a feeling that is different from the feeling of arriving at a place you like or a place you're comfortable. "That's what it felt like," she asked. "Like I'd been looking for it without knowing I was looking," he said. She was quiet. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the mountains to the east, which were doing now, in the cold November light, something quite similar to what he described. "I've never had that," she said. "A place like that." "What did it feel like before Dodge City?" he asked. "Like I was waiting," she said. "Like something was coming and I didn't know what it was." He was aware, with considerable force, that this was a moment, that this was the kind of sentence that exists on a fault line between two versions of a conversation. He could stay on the safe side and say something general and pleasant, or he could say what was actually true. "I think sometimes the thing you're waiting for isn't a place," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. The mountains were very pink in the early light, and the street was quiet, and the air tasted of cold and wood smoke. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose not." They sat in the silence for a while, and the silence was the richest kind. The kind that means something has been said in the space between words, and both people heard it. Over the following weeks, through November and into December, something built between them that was both ordinary and extraordinary in the way that the most significant things often are. They shared meals most mornings at Marjorie Walsh's. They walked together in the evenings when the weather allowed, along the road that went south toward the river, where the cottonwood trees had gone gold and then bare. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about books and politics, and the question of what the territory would look like when it became a state, about the children Sadie had taught, and the cases Tobias had handled, about their families and their mistakes and their beliefs. She began helping the schoolteacher, a tired young man named Arthur Whitmore who was struggling with 30 children in a single room, 3 days a week. She did not officially work for him, but she showed up and managed the older students with the ease of someone who had done it for years. And the children loved her immediately in the way that children love people who are genuinely paying attention to them. Tobias watched this from the schoolhouse window on a cold December afternoon, standing outside with a cup of coffee from Marjorie's going cold in his hand, and felt something that he recognized as entirely distinct from anything he'd felt for anyone before. It wasn't the particular beauty of her face in the winter light, although that was real. It wasn't the intelligence he'd admired from the beginning, or the courage, or the integrity. It was the fullness of her, all of it together in motion, being completely herself in a context where she could let herself be herself. The exhaustion was gone from her face. In its place was the animation of someone who had been given back something they'd had taken from them. And he stood in the cold December air and was so glad she was here that he felt it in the whole of his body. She saw him through the window and gave him a look that said she was aware he had been standing there and she did not mind. After school let out that afternoon, she came outside and they stood together in the street, and she said, "You were watching." "I was," he said. "No apology." "I wasn't asking for one," she said. "I was observing." She paused. "How long have you been standing in the cold?" "About an hour." She stared at him. "Your coffee must be completely frozen." "Mostly frozen," he agreed. She took the cup from his hand and looked at the surface of it, and handed it back with a level look that contained a great deal of warmth masquerading as exasperation. "Come to dinner," she said. Not Marjorie's. That evening she'd obtained permission from Edna Price to use the small kitchen at the back of the hotel, and she cooked. She was a competent, confident cook, practical and excellent, and she made a stew from the vegetables and salt pork available at this time of year that was extraordinary. They sat at the small table in the hotel's kitchen while the rest of the building conducted its business around them, and he noticed that she ate with real appetite now, which she hadn't when she'd first arrived. She'd eaten in the manner of someone who knows food is necessary, but isn't fully present for the experience. Now she was present. After dinner, they washed the dishes together in the way of two people who have done this together enough times to have a system, which they had. They'd established the system without discussing it. "I need to tell you something," he said, while they were working. "All right," she said. He considered how to say it and decided there was no version that was not direct, and that direct was what they were between them. "I would like to make something clear," he said, "about what I want, so there is no ambiguity and no one is navigating by guesswork." She set down the dish she was drying and turned to look at him. "I would like to be with you," he said. "I don't mean that casually. I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean, and I don't say this because it's what comes next in a series of shared meals and walks. I say it because it's true, and because I think you deserve to hear it said plainly." She was very still for a moment. "I'm still technically a witness in a federal case," she said. "I know. The prosecution won't be concluded until sometime in the spring. I know. I've been living in a hotel for 6 weeks, and I don't currently have a profession or an income." "You're teaching 3 days a week," he said. "And Arthur Whitmore told me last week he would very much like to make that arrangement permanent and formal if you're willing." She blinked. "He said that, he did. He thinks you're better at it than he is, which I think he's right about, but which is a separate matter from the question I'm asking." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "What exactly are you asking, Tobias? I want to hear the whole thing." He set down his own dish and turned to face her fully. "I am asking if you will let this be real," he said. "What this is, between us, if you will let it have a future instead of treating it as something that will end when the circumstances change. Because I think you've been keeping one foot at the door, ready to move on, and I understand why. I just don't want that to be the reason it doesn't become what I think it could be." She took a breath. "I have been," she admitted, "keeping that door available." "I know," he said. "It's a habit that's very difficult to break," she said. "When you've been moving for 2 years, when nothing has been permanent," she paused, "when nothing has been safe." "It's safe here," he said. "Not in the naive sense. The world is the world, but here specifically, you are safe here." She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her make the decision he'd been waiting for her to arrive at since the morning she'd come back to Dustfall. He watched her choose something. He watched her close the door that had always been open to exit. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you absolute man," she said, with the warmth that had been growing since the first time he'd seen it, fully present now. "Yes to all of it. Yes, this is real. Yes to the future." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back with the entirety of a person who had been careful about every choice for 2 years, and was making this one with everything she had. They stood in Edna Price's kitchen in the December lamplight, and it was not romantic in the grand cinematic sense. There were dishes soaking in the basin, and the fire in the stove needed feeding, and somewhere upstairs a guest was moving around with heavy feet. But it was completely real. and it was the beginning of something that both of them already knew was not going to end. December became January. January moved through itself with the slow, cold certainty of a New Mexico winter. Cold at night, bright during the day, the mountains wearing permanent white above the town. Sadie accepted the position at the school, which made Arthur Whitmore visibly relieved, and the children immediately pleased. She taught mathematics and reading, and a geography class that became so popular children who were not enrolled in her sections began attending anyway, which caused a minor administrative confusion that was resolved by simply accepting that she had taken on more students than anyone had planned for. Tobias came to the school on the days she was there and sat in the back during the last hour, ostensibly to be available in case of any needed presence, but actually because he liked to watch her work and had stopped pretending otherwise. She knew he was there, and tolerated it with a look that said she found it both endearing and slightly ridiculous. They had a conversation in late January that changed the formal shape of things. They were walking the south road toward the river in the late afternoon, their breath visible in the cold air, the cottonwood branches bare and silver against the winter sky. He had been thinking about it for weeks, and he had decided, in the manner that he made most decisions, that the time for deciding was when you were certain and he was certain. "I want to marry you," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped walking. They stood on the road with the dry grass brown around them and the silver trees ahead. "We've known each other for 4 months," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for immediate action. I'm telling you what I want so that we're navigating toward the same place." "You told me I was asking a question you wanted to hear the whole of. That's the whole of it." She looked at him. The December wind was moving her hair across her face, and she pushed it back and looked at him with eyes that were completely unguarded. "4 months," she said again, thoughtfully this time, not as an objection but as an observation. "Enough time to know a person," he said. "Some people would disagree," she said. "Some people don't pay attention," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the river which was low and silver in the winter light. "I knew within the first week," she said quietly, "that you were different, that what was happening was different. I've been trying not to know it since then, because it scared me more than Roy Carlin ever did." "Why more than him?" he asked. She looked at him with the full honesty that had become their native tongue with each other. "Because Roy Carlin couldn't take anything from me I couldn't afford to lose," she said. "This," she gestured between them, a small, precise gesture, "this is different. This is something I couldn't lose without it changing me." "You're not going to lose it," he said. "You can't promise that," she said. "No," he said, "but I can promise to be worth the risk." She laughed softly, turned toward him, closed the distance between them in 2 steps, and put her head against his chest, and his arms came around her, and they stood on the road in the January cold with the river moving quietly ahead of them. "Yes," she said into his coat. "I'll marry you, Tobias Irwin, when the time is right." The time arrived in late March, when the federal prosecution of Roy Carlin and his associates concluded in Albuquerque with guilty verdicts on 5 counts including theft of federal funds, conspiracy, and the intimidation of a federal witness. Carlin was sentenced to 14 years in the federal penitentiary. Dodd received 9. The man who had been the compromised official in the Santa Fe marshal's office, a man named George Pell who had sold Sadie's location to Carlin and received payment for it for 2 years, received 6 years and the permanent end of his public career. Harold Fitch sent a telegram to Tobias the morning the verdicts came in. It said, "Justice served. Tell Miss Keller she did something rare. Not many people hold the line for 2 years against an opponent with that many resources. She's something special. Tobias had the telegram framed by the printer and gave it to Sadie as a gift, which made her cry in the small, controlled way of someone who is crying from relief rather than grief. She was no longer a witness in an active case. She was a citizen of Dustfall, New Mexico territory, employed as a schoolteacher, residing at Edna Price's hotel, pending the conclusion of other arrangements. The wedding was on the 12th of April, 1883, in the small white church at the north end of Main Street. Reverend Thomas Bale performed the ceremony. The whole town attended, or near enough that the distinction didn't matter. Marjorie Walsh baked a wedding cake that was discussed in superlatives for weeks. Edna Price cried openly and without apology. Pete Carver stood as Tobias's best man and gave a toast that was short and genuine, and made everyone laugh at the end. Sadie wore a dress she and Edna Price had made over 2 weeks from a bolt of deep blue fabric that had come on the last supply wagon from Santa Fe. She carried white wildflowers. She walked down the aisle of the church on her own, because she had no family left who could walk her down it. And when Tobias saw her come through the door into the lamplight of the church interior, he had the profound physical sensation of something completing itself, a circle closing, an arc arriving at its destination. He took her hand at the altar, and she looked up at him with eyes that were bright with everything: happiness, relief, love that had been built carefully and with intention, and without any illusions about what the world was. "Nervous," she whispered. "Not even slightly," he said. Reverend Bale looked between them with some warmth and said, "Shall we begin?" They said yes. Their first home together was a house on the west end of town that had been empty for a year. It needed work, and they did it together through the spring and early summer, painting, repairing, arranging. Sadie brought to it a precision and a taste that Tobias found both admirable and occasionally humbling, and he brought to it a physical competence that meant most things that needed fixing got fixed correctly the first time, which she appreciated enormously. The house had a porch that faced south. They put chairs on it that spring, and most evenings when the light was right, they sat there together and watched the sky do what it does over New Mexico, which is something that cannot be adequately described but only witnessed. A theater of light and color that changes minute by minute and is never the same twice. It was on that porch in early July that Sadie told him she was pregnant. She told him directly, which was her way, and watched his face for the reaction with the alert attention of someone prepared for various possibilities. He looked at her for a long, long moment, and then he put his hands over his face and said, "Oh, my Lord," which was not the response she had been expecting. "Are you all right?" she asked. He put his hands down, and his face was doing several things at once, all of them in the direction of overwhelming joy. "I'm spectacularly all right," he said, and pulled her into his arms. The baby was born in February of 1884, in the back bedroom of the house on the west end of town, attended by Doc Reeves, who had been practicing medicine in Dustfall for 8 years, and had a steady hand and a dry sense of humor that was exactly what was needed in a medical professional. It was a boy. They named him Samuel James Irwin, Samuel for no ancestor in particular, but because they both liked the weight of it, and James for Harold Fitch's deputy who had come to Dustfall and helped resolve a situation that had weighed on Sadie for 2 years. Samuel was a loud, healthy child with Tobias's coloring and Sadie's eyes, which was the configuration that seemed entirely right to everyone who met him. Tobias held him in the lamplight of the bedroom an hour after his birth, standing by the window, with Sadie resting in the bed behind him, and he said something to the child in too quiet a voice for anyone else to hear. Later, when she asked, he told her he had been making a promise. "What kind of promise?" she asked. "The obvious kind," he said. "The kind where you promise to be better than everything that was hard about the world for you so that it's less hard for him." She looked at him across the room. Samuel was making the small sounds of a sleeping infant, oblivious to the enormity being assigned to him. "You're going to be very good at this," she said. "We both are," he said. Samuel James grew into the kind of child who was curious about everything and afraid of almost nothing, which kept his parents appropriately occupied. He was walking before he should have been, talking in full sentences by the time most children were managing words, and had an attachment to Tobias's hat that resulted in the hat spending significant time on the floor. The town of Dustfall grew around them. The territory moved toward statehood with the slow inevitability of political processes. The school expanded, and Sadie's position became formalized into something with a proper salary, and a second room added to the school building to manage the number of students. She taught mathematics to children who would grow up to be engineers and accountants and teachers themselves. And she tracked their progress the way she had always tracked it, with precise attention and genuine investment. Tobias was re-elected as sheriff in the spring of 1884 with every vote cast in his favor, which was either a measure of genuine popularity or the fact that no one felt like challenging him, and the distinction didn't concern him particularly. He served with the same quiet conviction he always had, the belief that the law was supposed to mean something, that someone with a badge had an obligation to hold a particular line. He trained his deputies with care. He maintained relationships with the other law officers in the territory, including the federal marshals in Albuquerque, where Harold Fitch sent him occasional letters about developments in the broader legal landscape of the region. Fitch retired completely in 1885 and came to visit Dustfall that summer, a bearded, weather-beaten man of 60 who sat on their porch for 2 evenings in a row and told stories about the territory in its earlier, harder days, and who held Samuel on his knee and told the child he had a mother who was braver than most people twice her size. Sadie, who had been listening from inside the house, came to the doorway with her arms folded and said, "You'll give him unrealistic expectations of women." "On the contrary," Fitch said, "I'm giving him accurate expectations." She could not argue with that and didn't try. The second child arrived in the spring of 1887. A girl this time, born in April when the desert was doing its brief, extravagant flowering, and the whole country around Dustfall was colored in ways that seemed improbable for a landscape that spent most of the year in various shades of bronze and red. They named her Clara Mee Irwin. Clara, because it was a name that had appeared in Tobias's life once before with sadness attached to it, and he thought it was time to give the name something better to belong to. And Mee because it was Sadie's mother's name, and her mother deserved to be remembered in the ongoing life of her daughter's family. Clara was quieter than Samuel had been as a baby and more observant, and showed from very early an inclination toward sitting with books that made Sadie say, "Oh, she's going to be trouble in the best possible way," which turned out to be accurate. With 2 children and a house and a school and a town and each other, the Irwins of Dustfall settled into the particular richness of a life that is full in every direction. There were difficult days, there were always difficult days, which is the nature of life and not a defect in it. There were illnesses, repaired with Doc Reeves and worry and time. There were professional challenges. There was the grief, in 1886, of Marjorie Walsh's death from a stroke, which affected the whole town but affected Sadie and Tobias particularly. because Marjorie's dining room had been the place where things began, and her absence created a gap that the town never quite filled the same way. But the difficult days were held in the context of everything else. The evenings on the porch with the sky performing its nightly theater, the meals around the table that became louder and more chaotic as the children grew, the letters from Fitch and from Pete Carver, who had eventually moved to Albuquerque and married and had a family of his own. The work that both of them loved and did well. The town that knew them and trusted them and was part of their life in the essential way that a community becomes part of a person when they stop moving and choose to belong somewhere. On a warm evening in late October of 1888, 6 years after Sadie Keller had ridden into Dustfall on a tired mare with secrets she'd been carrying alone for too long, she and Tobias sat on the south-facing porch of their house as the sun went down over the ridgelines, and the sky turned the specific color of hammered copper that it only gets in October in New Mexico. Samuel was inside doing his mathematics homework with a concentration that was both gratifying and slightly unnerving in a 4-year-old. Clara was asleep. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they are full, not empty, but settled. "I was thinking about something today," Sadie said. "Tell me," Tobias said. "I was thinking about the morning I rode in," she said. 6 years ago. I had planned to stop for the night and keep going. I had a route in my head. I was going to go to Chilarosa and then south, and I was going to find some town far enough from Colorado that Carlin's network wouldn't reach. And instead you found a farrier with opinions about horseshoes," he said. "And a sheriff who fed me biscuits under the guise of commerce," she said. "It was commerce. It was absolutely not commerce," he smiled. The sky was doing extraordinary things now, the copper deepening toward red. "I almost didn't come back," she said. "After that first day. I rode out and I thought, he's a decent man in a decent town and I am nothing but a problem in motion, and the kindest thing I can do is keep moving." "What changed your mind?" he asked. He knew the answer in general terms, but he had never asked for the specific. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. "You said I looked tired," she said. "Not suspicious, not like a problem, tired." She paused. "No one had said that. No one had looked at me and seen that. They saw the trouble I was carrying and they reacted to the trouble." "You saw the person carrying it." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand under his and held it. "I'm glad you came back," he said. "So am I," she said. "More than I can say. Every day." The sky continued its business of being the sky over the New Mexico desert. Infinite and particular. The same sky it had been before any of them arrived and would be after. But in this moment, in the October evening light, it was witness to two people sitting in the warmth of their own lives, having built something from what had appeared to be nothing but trouble and secrets and a stranger who couldn't quite bring herself to ride away. Sadie Keller had arrived in Dustfall as a stranger. She had arrived with secrets that had been crushing her for 2 years, with a bruise on her jaw and a tired horse and the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to keep moving, because stopping meant being found. She had planned to stay for 1 night, then 4 days, then 3 more. She had planned to leave and keep leaving until she found a place that couldn't be found. And a sheriff had looked at her and said she looked tired, and had offered a spare chair on a porch, and had refused, in the most essential, generous, uncoercive sense of the word, to let her simply ride away into the dark without being known. She set down her coffee cup and listened to her son work through a mathematics problem in the lamplight inside their house, and she held her husband's hand in the cooling October air, and she thought about the difference between the woman who had ridden into this town 6 years ago and the woman sitting on this porch now. The difference was not a simple one. It was not just safety, although that was part of it. It was not just love, although love was central to it in the way that load-bearing walls are central to a building, invisible when things are standing, essential to whether things stand at all. It was the difference between a person living in perpetual emergency and a person living in a life. It was the difference between carrying your secrets alone in the dark and having someone who knew all of them and loved you anyway. It was the difference between one foot always at the door and both feet planted. "You're thinking," Tobias said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "Specific thoughts," he said. "I can tell by the quality of the silence." She looked at him sidelong in the October dusk. After 6 years, she could look at him and still feel the full weight of what he was to her. Not diminished by familiarity but enriched by it, the way something you've been living with reveals more of itself over time. "I was thinking about arriving here," she said, "and what I would have missed." "Tell me," he said. "Everything," she said simply. "I would have missed everything." He brought her hand up and held it against his mouth for a moment. Not quite a kiss, just presence, warmth and contact, and the specific gravity of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing. The sky went from copper to deep rose to the particular dark blue that comes before the stars appear. And then the stars appeared. The enormous, uncountable stars of the New Mexico territory that had been the same in their splendor since long before there were people to look up at them. Inside the house, Samuel set down his pencil and called out that he was finished with his mathematics, and Tobias called back that he'd come check it in a moment. Clara made a brief sound in her sleep and was quiet again. The stars continued their indifferent, brilliant business. Sadie Keller had arrived as a stranger with secrets. The sheriff had refused to let her ride away. Everything else had followed from that. The discovery that secrets, once shared, lose most of their power. The discovery that staying in one place long enough for people to know you is not a vulnerability, but the opposite of one. The discovery that the right person, found at the right moment, under whatever improbable circumstances lead to such findings, is the thing that makes everything else make sense. Dustfall, New Mexico territory, population 347, sat in its shallow valley between the red sandstone ridgelines and continued being exactly what it was. A small town in the desert under an enormous sky, doing the ordinary business of existing while extraordinary things happened quietly within it, as they do in all places where people are paying enough attention. The Irwins sat on their porch until the night grew cold and then went inside to their children and their lamplight, and their supper and their life, which was large and specific and entirely their own, built on honesty and courage and the simple, radical act of one person stopping and really looking at another, and seeing not the trouble they carried, but the person beneath it.